So I think that beyond making pretty pictures of networks, I think what I'm most excited about is actually getting into the topological features of these networks. Real graph theory, as we call it, or network science, where we model these things as nodes and edges, and then we try to take several measurements, which you can think of these measurements as pretty much the exact same thing that you do in the wet lab, or not, maybe not exact, but very similar in the sense that measurements are a thing that each have their own limited scope. And so we have to take all kinds of different measurements to get a lot of little different scopes, and we put them together in order to get a bigger picture. And so I'm going to walk you through these as fast as I can, these 7 metrics that I chose to implement into the program, which both describe the network as a whole and attempt to cluster nodes. So the first thing that we do is we just simply look at how many constituents there are in a network. We just look at how many nodes there are and count how many edges there are. And this tells us, roughly speaking, very generally, I caution very generally, something of the complexity of the network, in the sense that if we have more and more parts, you have a more complicated system. But it's a little more informative to actually take the number of nodes and take the number of edges and create a ratio out of that. So to do that, we use the next thing we look at or we calculate is called average node connectivity, or average degree connectivity, where we look at each and every node and we just ask, what, in general, how many nodes is every node connected to in this network? You can imagine if you were to hold the number of nodes constant, and you were to keep adding edges, and of course, you have a little formula here, edges being in the numerator, that you must have a more interconnected network. There's nowhere to add those edges except for nodes that already exist. So by looking at this ratio of edges to nodes, we can get an idea of a general correlation to how interconnected the network is, which tells us something a little more of its complexity. Now, there's this other metric called network diameter of the largest component. That's the next thing that the program measures. I kind of forgot to explain earlier what a largest component is, but what I should have been clear about is that on any of these graphs, you may have 2 components of edges and nodes that are disconnected from one another. Usually we end up with 1 component. Oftentimes, if you run a lot of these things, as I have, you find a lot of your output is 1 large component, and then a lot of little artifacts of smaller disconnected components to the graph. So it's often useful to take a measurement from the largest component, such as the network diameter. And the network diameter tells us something of the efficiency level of dissemination of information across the network. By taking the 2 nodes that are the furthest apart and asking what is the shortest path and number of edges that would connect those nodes, we and then taking that number as a measure of the network diameter, we can tell a little bit of something about the ratio of the ability to disseminate information or travel through fewer edges, even as the network gets larger and larger. Underneath that, I just showed that another way that it's calculated is that you use what we call the weights of edges, where you assign a numeric value to each edge based off of some other data you might be incorporating in the network. But my program actually just uses the top method, just calculating network diameter in number of nodes. Next, there's this metric that is called transitivity, which describes just the general tendency of any given 3 nodes to form a triangle, or a transitive triad, as we call it. And it turns out that from studies done on social networks in humans, studies done in applying graph theory to biological molecules and building biological network models, that the tendency to form these triads or these triangles tends to be rather correlated with some kind of functional modules, or in our case, in our context, it could be something like a biological pathway. So it gives us some kind of insight into the level of organization in the network. So the last two metrics, they don't really describe the network. I don't use them in my program to describe the network as a whole or take sort of an average. I use these metrics to attempt to rank and cluster nodes. And they both center around this notion of centrality. There are two types of, I chose two ways to measure centrality, beginning with betweenness centrality. But what centrality is altogether is the general tendency of a node to be important to information flow within the network. By looking at, if we take into consideration on the top right, like this red node, for instance, it doesn't have very many connections. Yet it's connecting to very densely connected regions of a graph. Without this red node, you would have no way for these two regions to communicate with one another altogether. So betweenness centrality is a measurement of that. And just under that, I just have another example of that where you can see that you can quantify it, and you kind of eyeball and see that the number 4 has probably got the highest betweenness centrality, and indeed it does. Its value of 15 is more than twice the value of any other nodes. So my program will calculate the betweenness centrality for all nodes and rank the top 20 of those and give you that for output. And that's ranking. I also want to try classification to some extent by creating, and I'll remind you, modularity class is sort of in network science, it's pretty much synonymous with classification or creating groups of nodes. But as I had mentioned, the red node in this betweenness centrality example isn't connected to many nodes. Now, say you do want to take that into consideration. So in order for something to have a high value, it also needs to be connected to a lot of nodes. Well, eigenvector centrality is a way of measuring the centrality of a node while taking that into consideration, which just gives us another edge, a measurement of a little bit different scope when taking into consideration or trying to look at how tightly connected subgroups in a network are. So by clustering these nodes together, we can identify tightly clustered nodes, which you might later run gene enrichment analysis on or further explore in other ways.